Work log 20250130. Head of Reclamation, Alex Grimes. In an ideal world, I provide a meticulous, time-stamped breakdown of all 333 recorded documentation clips from this cycle. Every bolt tightened, every servo realigned, every catastrophic failure mid-repair. But considering I'd rather not spend the next fiscal year narrating the finer details of industrial tedium, we're going to try something radically different: efficiency. Instead of all of that jazz, I'm going to summarize as much as I can within this report. And if you all at the archive hate me for it, then so be it. I'm just trying to get my job done. This is probably the final report on the Reclamation Extractor Rex project. Maybe. We'll see how bored I am in the future. I'll try covering live field integration, efficiency metrics, and operational durability assessments. Of course, getting to this point required wading through Dominion-mandated morale preservation periods, aka forced holiday vacations in December, and a temporary software embargo that left half of my documentation locked behind a corporate firewall. Oh, and let's not forget that half of the yard came down with some variant of sickness, a sector-wide outbreak of polymorphic respiration syndromes, because air filters and face masks within the district are apparently optional, meaning, once again, I was left to keep the entire operation from grinding to a halt all by myself. And I did it. Despite the odds, the work got done. So let's get on with it. Last we left off, Rex was in need of a bath, so I started off by utilizing our only pressure washer filled with isopropanol to degrease every square millimeter I could off of this dirty boy. This might be good enough on its own, but I'm not sure. And that would require testing, which I don't have time for. I also ended up using a manual power scrubber to try and remove as much debris and oil off of every component I could reach in preparation for final surface treatments. Of course, the Dominion loves its red tape, and they just mandated a new rule that federal machines must visibly hold the new Royal Technocratic Dominion insignia. Fine, more work to slow us down, but it'll never stop me. After the last report where we reclaimed water tank aluminum, I've been itching to use it, so this at least gives me an excuse to try some stamping machinery we've got lying around. This does look pretty snazzy, although installation requires some modification in order for it to fit in place. I'm just thankful Rex is big enough to carry such a large sign. I have no idea how others would manage to fit this massive hazard symbol on their machines. After everything is washed clean, it's a good idea to mask off any joints and bearings to prevent them from getting clogged with paint. It's either more work now or more work later, so pick your poison. You don't see a lot of Dominion suits wandering around the Omniwaste Reclamation District. It's too messy, too dangerous, too beneath them, I guess. They keep their noses clean and leave us to wrestle with the junk. So when one actually does show up, you know it's got to be something important or weird. And that's exactly what happened. I was elbow deep in grease, trying to knock some dents out of one of Rex's arm assemblies when this figure just appeared. Out of nowhere, like they'd been dropped from a drone or something. They weren't in uniform, at least not fully, but they had the badge clear as day, the new Dominion insignia. That's not something you fake if you want to keep breathing. They said they'd gotten my request. You know, the paperwork I filed with the Ministry of Omniplex Resources about the pile shrinking, except instead of the usual runaround or a form letter telling me to remain productive, this person actually came out here. They didn't give me a name, rank, nothing like that. They just said they were there to assure me that the pile shrinking wasn't a problem, that it wasn't a sign we were running out of resources, but proof that the system was becoming more efficient, whatever that means. The thing is, they didn't seem official, or like someone with just enough power to wander into a place like this without getting hassled. The kind of person you don't ask too many questions about. And here's the kicker, they found me in the middle of the yard. Do you know how impossible that is, especially when I'm hiding? This place is chaos, a maze of debris and scrap as far as the eye can see. Dominion types don't step foot in here, let alone track down one specific guy. They didn't linger long. They just said what they had to say and walked off, leaving me with more questions than answers. But I'll admit, it did ease my mind a little. I mean, if someone that high up is taking the time to track me down and say everything's fine, maybe it really is. Or maybe they just don't want me digging deeper. But I couldn't get this interaction off of my mind, and it felt it was important to describe in my report. Nothing else has changed, so that's all I've got about that. If I disappear one day, maybe this log will explain why. Regardless, I've got too much work to dwell on it, so let's keep going. The only spray gun I used for paint was, of course, in need of maintenance right when I needed it, so I tried to temporarily use a spare sprayer. This meant my paint filters didn't fit, and I had to go yak shaving to even start the painting process. Which, by the way, if you've never tried spraying safety yellow on a massive gray primer about 10 meters tall, it's an absolute nightmare, especially when your air filters fail and fumes blast out in every direction. Thankfully, I actually wear PPE while working, unlike some of the sick guys around here. After having 2 barrels of yellow paint blast out everywhere across the yard, I needed to take some time for my mental health and do something else. An old storage unit that's been poorly utilized was torn down and thrown in the pile, while everything else I care about was cleaned and placed elsewhere. After cleaning out the spray isolation chamber filters, I started up on my 3rd barrel of paint. Not because I like using fancy layering techniques with multiple colors, but because the other barrels ran out. Remind me to never paint something this large again. This is around the time I noticed the permanent filters were pretty clogged, and who knows if they were doing anything. Since no one else around here seems to be doing any maintenance, I just threw them away. Maybe that'll make it easier to change the actual filters in the future so we stop having health code violations. And while I was at it, I cleaned up the isolation chamber because it was leaking grossness out of the seams all across the building and I wanted to seal them up. Thankfully, we have like 6 gajillion meters of PVC weather stripping that I guess no one likes using because we have a lot of it here in the district, and I was able to put as much sealant in the chamber as I had time for. And wouldn't you know it, I actually had to spend money on this recycled robot because we ran out of our 3rd barrel of yellow paint. Spoiler alert, we also ran out of the 4th barrel. Why must everything be difficult? It was worth it though. Tell me that's not worth it. It's around this time you'd think, we've done it, home stretch. Just a few assemblies to put together, some field testing, and then finally, we get to move some garbage around. But no, of course not. Turns out there's still half of this audit left to summarize, because apparently building the machine isn't enough. Gotta have the paperwork to prove it. Anyways, we start with the unmasking. All of that work we did before, we get to undo it. A trick I love to utilize is separating ethylene vinyl acetate sealant using isopropanol. It pops off no problem, but you need to be mindful of the solvent eating into your paint layers if you aren't careful. Next, we can move on to metallic coatings. This is a general-purpose coating I like to put on several functional parts of the machine to increase longevity and reduce long-term maintenance issues. It helps with heat dissipation, corrosion resistance, friction reduction, and so on. It's again either more work now or more work later, but I think this will reduce overall problems in the long run. Parts like the reclaimed hydraulic pistons are a pain to coat well, but all of the parts from PCBWay have been an absolute joy to work with. Whether it's their high-quality 3D printing services, CNC machining, or custom PCB fabrication, PCBWay consistently delivers precision and reliability. Their parts not only look great, but their customization always fits into my designs, making the build process smoother and more enjoyable. Rex wouldn't be nearly as refined or functional without the contributions of these expertly crafted components. If only everything in the reclamation yard worked this smoothly. The right coatings can make all of the difference on a build's effectiveness. I was pretty satisfied with the state of Rex and put each subassembly into storage while I had to address other concerns I mentioned at the intro of this audit. That's when disaster struck. I'd love to say every bit of wear and tear on this thing is the result of rigorous field testing and carefully controlled conditions. But truth be told, working in the reclamation zone has its own set of challenges. With idiocracy. See, I ran a few tests on the parts, just enough to chip some paint and give it a proper scuff. But then someone, who clearly didn't bother with the paperwork, hauled the parts off thinking that they were scrap. Took me a week and a mountain of red tape to figure out where they dumped them, and by the time I got them back, they'd been sitting out in a storm, half buried in debris, rust everywhere. Now, sure, I could strip it all down, clean it, and repaint it, but that's not exactly in my budget or the schedule. And hey, if it's still functional after all of that, I'd say I did my job right. A little rust never stopped a bulldozer from doing its job, and it's not going to stop this mech either. Good enough for the Dominion, good enough for me. And if it's not good enough, hold people accountable for throwing away in-progress projects rather than taking it up with me. There were, unfortunately, some parts that received more damage, probably from something like a refrigerator falling on the parts. I made sure to go back over the worst damage and fill it with some more primer to prevent the damage from creeping under the paint job. Before the last final assembly, I gave the biodiesel engines some runtime to make sure that they were still functional. As you might expect of a painted exhaust system, a lot of the surface corroded off from the heat because my wallet isn't about to pay for chromed machinery. This mech, like everything around here, isn't exactly babied. It's been exposed to the elements, thrown into the dirt, left out in the open, and who knows what else. As much as I try to protect the most important components, rust just happens when things are left to the mercy of the wasteland. That's part of why everything is built so thick and robust, to prevent rust from being an issue for a while. I'm not trying to let Rex rust, but I am trying to show that it's been through the grind. It's not about adding it on purpose, it's about showing how this machine's seen some action. And it shows. When you've got a big old hot steel tube running for hours, it's gonna rust. Walking around in mud for a while, it's gonna rust. Parked outside for any amount of time, it's probably gonna rust. After finding every missing part of Rex, and after patching up the worst damage, and after making sure there were no structural issues due to the surface rust that started accumulating, I decided to start the final assembly. Another spoiler alert, it's not the last assembly. At the very least, we can get most of Rex assembled and make sure nothing has been dinged up so bad that it's not going to function anymore. But I didn't really have concerns about that since Rex is built like a literal tank mech, just without the fancy EMP protection and weaponry. Getting everything back together is a breeze and speaks to the steps taken earlier in the process to make this as painless as possible. Although I will have to pull some parts off to do the final hydraulic installation, having Rex all in one piece will significantly speed up system testing by doing a full integration run with all parts running, minus the hydraulics. I had to step away once again for some other responsibilities, but as fate would have it, the Omniplex got hit by one of those freak weather systems that seems to be a hallmark of this time of year. There was a dust storm, nothing too unusual about that. But then came the intermittent bursts of rain, a strange combination to say the least. It's hard to describe what it's like to be in a place that is simultaneously dry and wet, but it's exactly what happened as the storm raged. The usual methods for collecting precious rainwater were thrown into chaos by the sand blowing in from the expanse. That salty, barren wasteland of dust never made things easy, but this was a new level of miserable. Imagine the heavy wetness of soaking clothes, only for someone to throw a bucket of sawdust at you, then spray you down with more water, and then more dust. The dry sand kicked up by the winds settled over everything, and I mean everything, just in time for the rain to hit. Wet salt. It doesn't take a mechanical genius to know that's bad news for anything made of metal. And yet, despite the relentless assault of salty rain and dust, Rex held its ground, as stubborn as ever. Just another day of work, I suppose. After that nonsense ended, I was able to clean up a bit and get on with the hydraulics, the last system to implement into the Mech. Thankfully, I didn't try to get these hoses attached earlier, because I bet some ridiculousness involving the wrath of every deity would do its best to destroy them. As I get the hydraulic tubing in place, it's always one of those tedious steps that makes you think, is this really going to work? Each tube has to be carefully routed, tightened just right, and checked for leaks. It's not glamorous work, but without it, nothing would move. These pistons are the heart of Rex's mobility, giving it the strength it needs to take on whatever the pile throws at it. Every connection, every fitting, has to be secure, because if even one of these tubes gives, it could take everything down with it. It's all about precision, and right now, that's exactly what I'm focused on. As always, additional footage has been attached to this audit showcasing what's been done, per the usual red tape. Well, here we are. Tired, a bit battered, but I'm proud of what's been done. Rex isn't perfect. It's got its dents, its flaws, and a few too many signs of wear. But that's the thing about progress. It doesn't always look perfect, but it's still moving forward. For the district, for the people who need something to rely on out here, and for me. It's proof that I can still make something work, even in the mess we've got. Not the best, but definitely better than when we started. And that's something worth standing behind. That's all I've got for now. I'll see you when I see you. End log 20250130. A new Infosphere analyst is supporting the Royal Archive. Thanks.